September 20th, 1940, approximately 2 p.m., Arlington Hall Station, Virginia. Amidst the clatter of teletype machines and the thick, stale air of a guarded office, a ghost in the machine finally appeared. Frank Byron Rowlett, a quiet cryptanalyst for the Signal Intelligence Service, leaned forward, his eyes locked on a stream of alphanumeric gibberish printed on a 3-foot-long sheet of paper. After 18 months of crushing intellectual labor, he saw it, a faint, cyclical pattern in the enciphered vowels. It was a subtle mistake, a whisper of order in a storm of chaos. But for Rowlett and his superior, Colonel William Friedman, it was the key to unlocking an empire's most guarded secrets. The man ultimately responsible for this monumental effort, Colonel William Frederick Friedman, wasn't a soldier by trade. He was a geneticist, a graduate of Cornell University's class of 1914, whose mind saw cryptographic patterns the way he once saw genetic sequences. A civilian scientist in a reserve officer's uniform, Friedman was a chain-smoking force of nature, often seen with his green eye shade pulled low, lost in a world of ciphers and probabilities. By late 1940, the immense pressure of leading the SIS and hunting the elusive purple cipher had worn him to a nub. The 18-hour days, fueled by black coffee and nicotine, were pushing him toward a documented nervous breakdown, a price he was willing to pay to give his country an impossible advantage in a war he knew was coming. He was a genius, teetering on the brink of collapse, haunted by a machine he couldn't see but had to defeat. The man who caught the ghost that day was Friedman's most brilliant protégé, Frank Byron Rowlett. Unlike the volatile Friedman, Rowlett was the picture of calm persistence. A former high school chemistry and mathematics teacher from Rose Hill, Virginia, with a degree from the University of Virginia, he was recruited into the SIS back in 1930. He didn't possess Friedman's explosive insight, but he had an unparalleled intellectual doggedness. For months, he meticulously charted the outputs from Japan's Type B cipher machine, known to them only as purple. While others saw random noise, Rowlett's methodical mind perceived a fatal flaw. The machine separated the 26 letters into two groups, the 6s and the 20s, and the encryption for the 6 vowels was tragically simpler, more repetitive. It was a pattern even Friedman had initially missed, a quiet discovery that would echo like a thunderclap across the Pacific. But theory was one thing, application was another. The task of physically recreating a machine no American had ever laid eyes on fell to First Lieutenant Leo Rosen, a fresh-faced prodigy from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, class of 1938. An electrical engineer with zero experience in complex cipher systems, Rosen was handed Rowlett's abstract theories and told to build a 2-ton monster. He was supported by the mathematical bedrock of the SIS, Dr. Solomon Kolbach and Dr. Abraham Sinkov, 2 of Friedman's original recruits, who provided the foundational proofs. Inside the blacked-out windows of the munitions building, Rosen began the impossible task of reverse engineering the purple machine, mapping out a labyrinth of over 6,000 wires and 2,000 telephone-style stepping switches, his work illuminated by bare bulbs and fueled by the hum of raw electricity, the constant scent of ozone filling the cramped, guarded space. This breakthrough wasn't just an academic victory. It was the creation of a weapon codenamed Magic. It was a skeleton key that would unlock the most secret diplomatic and military intentions of the Japanese Empire just 1 week before they signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. Before I tell you how Colonel Friedman and his brilliant team at the SIS managed to build a perfect functional duplicate of a machine they had never seen, comment here where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of how they gained a secret audience to Japan's march to war. The world stage in late 1940 was a terrifying spectacle of unchecked aggression. In Europe, the Blitz had been unleashed upon London since September 7, 1940, with Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe dropping over 18,000 tons of high explosives in just over 8 months. For 57 consecutive nights, the city burned. From the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his advisors, including the influential Harry Hopkins, watched with growing alarm. They knew that the fall of Great Britain, led by the defiant Prime Minister Winston Churchill, would leave the U.S. terrifyingly alone, a situation that made the quiet work at Arlington Hall not just important, but existentially vital. Across the globe, the Empire of Japan was making its own moves, driven by the militaristic vision of men like General Hideki Tojo. On September 22, 1940, just 2 days after Frank Rowlett's breakthrough, over 30,000 Imperial Japanese Army troops moved into French Indochina, securing a vital strategic foothold for a southern push. This aggression triggered a swift, though limited, response from Washington. On September 26, 1940, President Roosevelt, advised by Secretary of State Cordell Hull, placed an embargo on all exports of scrap iron and steel to Japan. This was the first real economic shot across the bow, a direct threat to a war machine whose Type 97 Chiha tanks and Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters were built with imported American steel and ran on imported American oil. The air in the Pacific, already thick with tropical humidity, now carried the unmistakable scent of approaching conflict. Meanwhile, the United States military was in a state of frantic, belated expansion. In 1939, the U.S. Army ranked a shocking 17th in the world, smaller than the armed forces of Portugal. The Selective Training and Service Act of September 16, 1940, was a desperate measure orchestrated by Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall to begin transforming this skeletal force. The act called for the registration of 16 million men, aiming to swell the ranks from under 270,000 to over 1.4 million. In dusty training camps across the country, new recruits smelled the thick odor of canvas and cosmoline as they were issued the M1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle, a World War I relic, because production of the new semi-automatic M1 Garand couldn't yet meet the demand. This was the Army tasked with facing the battle-hardened legions of the Axis. Against this backdrop, American intelligence was a patchwork of fledgling, underfunded, and fiercely rivalrous organizations. The Army's Signal Intelligence Service, led by Colonel William Friedman, and the Navy's OP-20G, under the brilliant but difficult commander Lawrence Safford, were the two principal players. They had previously collaborated to break Japan's RED diplomatic cipher back in 1935, but the new Purple system was a quantum leap in complexity. With a combined staff of fewer than 200 cryptanalysts and support personnel in 1940, these two agencies were locked in a silent, desperate race against time, their offices filled with the low, constant hum of primitive tabulating machines that whirred day and night. The diplomatic front was a carefully choreographed dance of deception. In Washington, the newly arrived Japanese ambassador, Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura, began a series of high-stakes negotiations with Secretary of State Cordell Hull in February 1941. Nomura, a moderate, seemed to genuinely seek a peaceful resolution, but his instructions came directly from Tokyo, from hardline Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka, via the Purple Cipher machine. The Japanese believed this electromechanical marvel, with its complex telephone-style stepping switches and two 500 RPM motors, was their impenetrable shield, allowing them to present a face of peace to Hull while discussing war plans in total secrecy. Over 11 formal meetings took place between March and July 1941, each one a charade where one side was, unbeknownst to them, about to have their entire playbook read by the other. The War of Whispers was fought by radio operators in lonely outposts across the vast Pacific. At listening posts like Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and Station Cast in the Philippines, U.S. Navy radiomen, including pioneers like Chief Radioman Harry Kidder, spent grueling 12-hour shifts, hunched over receivers, their ears pressed to headphones. They strained to pull faint signals out of the ether, the sharp crackle of static, a constant companion as they transcribed the endless streams of Morse code or encrypted radio teletype signals. These intercepts, thousands of meaningless five-letter groups, were then bundled and flown thousands of miles back to Washington, D.C., where men like Frank Rowlett and Dr. Abraham Sinkoff would stare at them for days on end, searching for a single exploitable flaw in the enemy's armor. This was the raw material of magic, disembodied signals plucked from the air between Tokyo and its embassies on the other side of the world. Complicating matters was the deep-seated institutional rivalry between the services. The Army's intelligence branch, G2, led by General Sherman Miles, and the Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, under Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson, often operated as independent fiefdoms. They didn't just compete for resources, they actively withheld information from one another. This stovepiping meant that a crucial piece of Army intelligence might never reach the Navy, and vice versa. Even after the Purple Breakthrough in September 1940, the distribution of the resulting magic intelligence was a political and bureaucratic nightmare, a flaw in the system that would haunt the United States in the months to come. The stiff wool of their uniforms seemed to symbolize the rigid, uncooperative thinking that plagued the intelligence community. Life inside Arlington Hall Station was a pressure cooker. Colonel William Friedman, the Cornell-educated geneticist-turned-cryptologist, was a man possessed. He stalked the halls of the munitions building, a lit cigarette perpetually dangling from his lips, his green eyeshade pulled low. The air was a toxic fog of his chain-smoking, the metallic scent of ozone from overworked machinery, and the palpable tension of men pushed to their absolute mental limits. The team he had assembled, former teachers like Frank Rowlett and Ph.D. mathematicians like Dr. Solomon Kolbach, recruited as early as 1930, worked in monastic seclusion. They knew they were fighting a secret war, a battle of wits against an unseen enemy, a battle whose outcome could determine the fate of millions. The enemy's confidence was their greatest weakness. The Japanese Foreign Ministry, relying on the genius of their lead engineer, Kazuo Tanabe, considered the Purple Machine to be their crowning achievement in communications security. Introduced in 1939, it was not based on the German Enigma's rotor system, which they knew was a theoretical vulnerability. Instead, its use of 4 massive telephone stepping switches created a polyalphabetic substitution cipher of such complexity that they deemed it unbreakable by any known cryptanalytic method. This technical arrogance, this absolute faith in their machine's perfection, meant they didn't even conceive that an adversary could reverse engineer its logic without capturing a physical unit. That clean, metallic click of the switches in the Japanese embassy on Massachusetts Avenue was, to them, the sound of absolute secrecy. The strategic stakes were astronomical. In the Atlantic, the Battle of Britain, raging from July to October 1940, had proven that air power was the new king of the battlefield. In the Pacific, Japan's war in China was a voracious consumer of resources, and its military planners, under the strategic guidance of men like Admiral Osami Nagano, were looking south to the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. They needed an estimated 4.9 million tons of oil annually, and the American embargoes were tightening like a noose. As a deterrent, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, under the command of Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, had been moved from its base in San Diego to Pearl Harbor in May 1940. It was a powerful statement, a fleet of 9 battleships and 3 aircraft carriers floating at anchor, but it was also a concentration of force that was becoming an increasingly tempting target. This difference in strategic thinking was profound. The U.S. Navy, guided by the November 12, 1940 Plan Dog memo from Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold R. Stark, was committed to a Germany-first strategy in the event of a two-ocean war. The Pacific was to be a holding action, but the Imperial Japanese Navy, under the innovative and daring command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was already wargaming a radical new doctrine, a crippling surprise attack using its carrier fleet. By 1941, Japan had 10 aircraft carriers to America's 7, and their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, introduced in July 1940, was superior to any carrier-based aircraft the U.S. possessed. This fundamental, aggressive shift in Japanese naval doctrine was a secret kept behind the wall of their ciphers. Back home, President Roosevelt navigated a treacherous political landscape. The powerful America First Committee, boasting over 800,000 members and championed by figures like aviator Charles Lindbergh, preached a message of strict isolationism. Roosevelt had just won his third presidential term on November 5, 1940, partly on the promise that he would not send American boys into foreign wars. This forced his administration, including key figures like Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, to prepare for war in the shadows. The sound of FDR's calm, reassuring voice in his fireside chats, broadcast into millions of American homes, was a world away from the urgent, frantic reality unfolding inside the guarded fences of Arlington Hall Station, where the true intentions of the Japanese Empire were slowly, painstakingly being laid bare. The operational environment for the codebreakers was one of absolute, suffocating secrecy. Guards from the 2nd Signal Service Battalion patrolled the perimeter of Arlington Hall 24 hours a day. All wastepaper, every scrap of notation, was meticulously collected and burned in a special incinerator under armed supervision. The men on the inside, like First Lieutenant Leo Rosen, the MIT-trained engineer tasked with the impossible job of building the decrypting machine, couldn't breathe a word of their work, not even to their wives. This compartmentalization was essential for security, but it fostered an atmosphere of intense psychological isolation. For Colonel Friedman, this burden was personal. He felt as though the future security of the United States rested squarely on his shoulders, a weight that was pushing him toward a mental collapse in early 1941. The tactical problem itself was a cryptologist's nightmare. The Signal Intelligence Service possessed no purple machine, no wiring diagrams, and no operating keys. Their only weapon was human intellect and rudimentary IBM tabulators. They had nothing but the raw intercepts, long sheets of teletype paper covered in thousands of 5-letter groups that represented the encrypted Japanese diplomatic traffic. It was in this sea of gibberish that Frank Byron Rowlett, after 18 agonizing months, found the crucial pattern on September 20, 1940. The discovery that the sixes, the vowels, A, E, I, O, U, Y, were encrypted on a simpler repeating cycle compared to the 20s, the consonants, wasn't just a clue, it was the key to the entire kingdom, the single thread that, if pulled, could unravel the whole tapestry. And so the board was set in the early months of 1941. In Europe, a continent was in chains. In the Pacific, an empire, led by men like General Tojo and Admiral Yamamoto, was preparing for a massive, violent expansion, its path lubricated by the oil it desperately needed. In Washington, Ambassador Nomura and Secretary Hull spoke of peace, their conversations a diplomatic fiction. And in a former girls' college in Arlington, Virginia, a small band of exhausted geniuses, men like William Friedman, Frank Rowlett, and Leo Rosen, were about to perform an act of intellectual alchemy. They were going to build a ghost, a perfect mechanical echo of a machine they had never seen, and in doing so, they would grant their president a power beyond measure, the ability to listen to his enemy's most secret thoughts. The moment Frank Rowlett's quiet discovery landed on his desk, Colonel William Friedman, a man already hollowed out by 18 months of failure, felt a jolt of near-maniacal energy. On September 21, 1940, ignoring the tremor in his own hands, Friedman handed Rowlett's abstract vowel pattern analysis to a brilliant, untested first lieutenant named Leo Rosen. The order was simple, direct, and utterly impossible. Build a perfect replica of a machine no American had ever seen. The air in Friedman's office, thick with the smell of stale Pall Mall smoke, suddenly crackled with the scent of a dawning, terrifying possibility. First Lieutenant Leo Rosen, fresh out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, class of 1938, was an electrical engineer with zero experience in complex cryptanalytic systems. On October 1, 1940, Colonel Friedman and his chief assistant, Dr. Solomon Kullback, sat Rosen down in a guarded room filled with the low, constant hum of IBM tabulating machines. They presented him with Rowlett's meticulous charts and the foundational mathematical proofs developed by Kullback and Dr. Abraham Sinkoff. Rosen, a young man with a sharp, angular face and perpetually ink-stained fingers, was given an initial budget of just $697.65 for parts and told to construct a ghost from its shadow. The weight of the 20-page theoretical document in his hands felt heavier than any piece of hardware he had ever lifted. The initial phase of the project, begun on October 5, 1940, was a painstaking effort to reverse engineer the logic of the sixes. Rosen, working with a skeleton crew of just 4 technicians, started by mapping the stepping sequences of the vowel encrypting circuit. They sourced their primary components from surplus stock, dozens of Western Electric Type 207 telephone stepping switches, each a mechanical nightmare of 6 levels and 25 contacts. By late October, the constant rhythmic pock-clack-clack of relays firing in sequence became the soundtrack to their 18-hour days. Rosen, his uniform perpetually rumpled and smelling of burnt solder, worked alongside his senior NCO, a grizzled Signal Corps veteran named Master Sergeant Joseph O'Connell. Together, they burned through over 500 feet of 22-gauge copper wire just to create a breadboard model that could successfully replicate the first few patterns Rowlett had identified, a small victory in a vast, unknown war. But the 20s were a different beast entirely. The consonant encrypting section of the Purple machine was exponentially more complex, utilizing what the team theorized were 3 distinct stages of stepping switches operating in a cascading, non-linear sequence. Dr. Solomon Kullback, a quiet, intense man with a Ph.D. in mathematics from George Washington University, spent over 200 hours in November 1940 running statistical frequency analyses on an IBM Type 285 numeric tabulator. The machine, processing thousands of punch cards fed by 2 dedicated privates, filled the room with a deafening clatter and the smell of hot oil, but it gave Rosen the mathematical blueprint he desperately needed to even begin mapping the labyrinthine consonant wiring. Construction of the full analog machine, known internally only as the A machine, began in earnest on December 1, 1940. This wasn't a computer. It was a massive electromechanical switchboard designed to be a perfect physical mirror of the Japanese device. Rosen's team, now expanded to 12 technicians working in 3 shifts, began the agonizing process of wiring the main 7x 8 by 7 foot steel frame. Each of the more than 2,000 relays and over 6,000 individual wires had to be perfectly placed and soldered. A single misplaced connection could render the entire $10,000 project useless. Colonel Friedman, his face etched with exhaustion, would often stand silently in the doorway for hours in the dead of night, the cherry of his cigarette the only light on his face, watching Rosen and Master Sergeant O'Connell work, their movements precise and economical under the harsh glare of bare work lamps. The operational security was absolute, a suffocating blanket of secrecy. The entire project was confined to a single, windowless room in the munitions building, designated Room 305. Entry was controlled by a 2-man armed guard from the 2nd Signal Service Battalion, and the access logs were personally reviewed every 12 hours by Friedman's executive officer, Major Harold Dowd. No written materials ever left the room. All waste paper, faulty wiring, and draft schematics were collected at 1,800 hours daily and personally escorted to a dedicated incinerator where they were burned to ash under armed supervision. The men were effectively quarantined, their profound isolation, a key component of the weapon they were building. By mid-January 1941, the machine was a terrifying, beautiful jungle of wires, but it wasn't working. Leo Rosen, now gaunt and sleep-deprived, his MIT-class ring loose on his finger, was facing a crisis of complexity. The 6s section replicated the vowel patterns perfectly, but the 3-stage 20 section was producing nothing but gibberish. The problem, as Dr. Abraham Sinkoff deduced after a 72-hour non-stop analytical session on January 22, was in the, quote, stepping rate. The speed at which the switches advanced wasn't uniform. It varied based on a complex repeating pattern. For 2 agonizing weeks, Rosen's team frantically modified the cam mechanisms driving the switches, filing them down by mere thousandths of an inch. The high-pitched squeal of metal on the workshop lathe was a sound of desperation, echoing in the guarded room until 3 a.m. most mornings. The final key came from Colonel Friedman himself, who, just before his own health collapsed, suggested the stepping pattern wasn't time-based, but was tied to the input character itself. The definitive breakthrough came at 4:17 a.m. on February 11, 1941. After 4 months and 28 days of relentless work, the final connection was soldered into place. First Lieutenant Leo Rosen, his hands trembling with a mixture of caffeine and exhaustion, fed a previously intercepted purple message from late 1940 into the machine's teletype input. The device, now officially designated the converter M134T4, word to life. Over 2,000 relays began to click and clack in a deafening chorus, a mechanical symphony of pure logic. The cramped room filled with the sharp smell of hot metal and ozone. On the output teletype, letter by letter, a clear Japanese sentence began to form. Frank Rowlett and a handful of others stood over Rosen's shoulder, not breathing, watching the ghost they had hunted for nearly 2 years finally speak its first words. It worked. It was a perfect one-to-one functional duplicate of a machine none of them had ever laid eyes on. The total cost for the first 4 operational units had ballooned to over $100,000, but the price was utterly irrelevant. They hadn't just built a decryptor, they had built a Japanese purple machine from scratch. The intelligence product derived from this miracle of engineering was immediately given the code name Magic, and its classification was set at Top Secret Ultra, a level of secrecy so high that fewer than 75 people in the entire U.S. government would be cleared to read its contents. The first Magic machine was immediately put into 24-hour operation, but the work was far from over. The SIS, under the joint direction of Colonel Friedman and his Navy counterpart, the brilliant Commander Lawrence Safford of OP-20G, began a small-scale production line. 2 more machines were built for the Army by the end of March 1941, and 2 were delivered to the Navy. A 6th machine was secretly disassembled, crated, and shipped under armed guard to the British Code-Breaking Center at Bletchley Park, a gesture of alliance overseen personally by Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. These 2-ton behemoths were delicate instruments. Each day, the Japanese would change the key, the starting positions of the switches, and each day, the brilliant cryptanalysts, now led by Dr. Kolbach while Friedman recovered from his breakdown, would have to deduce the new key from the raw traffic, a process that could take anywhere from 4 to 12 agonizing hours. The secret war had begun. In the Japanese embassy on Massachusetts Avenue, Washington, D.C., Captain Yuzuru Sanamatsu, a naval attaché with meticulously combed hair and a rigid posture learned at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, conducted his morning ritual. At 0800 hours on March 5, 1941, he would personally inspect their Type B Cipher machine. He'd run a gloved finger over its cool gray steel chassis, feeling the faint vibration from its 500 RPM motor. He trusted this 300-pound marvel of engineering, a creation of the brilliant Kazuo Tanabe, implicitly. For Sanamatsu and his superior, Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura, the solid rhythmic click of its stepping switches was the sound of absolute, inviolable secrecy, a shield behind which an empire could plan a war. Back at Arlington Hall, the operational tempo was relentless. The first of the M134T4 analog machines, now housed in the guarded confines of Room 305, ran 24 hours a day. Its operators, like Private First Class Richard P. Johnson, a 19-year-old farm boy from Ames, Iowa, had no idea what they were doing. Johnson, who'd never seen a machine more complex than a John Deere Model A tractor, simply fed spools of perforated paper tape into the reader, his ears buzzing from the constant, deafening clatter of over 2,000 relays firing in sequence. The room smelled perpetually of hot vacuum tubes and the solvent used to clean the switch contacts, a scent that clung to his uniform long after his 12-hour shift ended. By March 15, 1941, he and the other 20 enlisted men of the 2nd Signal Service Battalion were processing over 50 intercepts a day, turning the enemy's secrets into raw, readable Japanese text. The cardinal rule of magic, laid down by General George C. Marshall himself, was plausible deniability. No military action could ever be taken, based solely on a magic intercept. This doctrine, known as parallel construction, was a frustrating art form. In late March 1941, magic revealed the arrival of a new Japanese consul in Honolulu, a man named Tadashi Morimura, who was, in fact, a naval intelligence officer named Takeo Yoshikawa, sent to scout Pearl Harbor. Instead of arresting him, Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson of the ONI was ordered by Army G-2 Chief General Sherman Miles to place him under loose, routine surveillance. The 2 FBI agents assigned the task, Robert L. Shivers and John E. Laro, watched for months as Yoshikawa meticulously documented the Pacific Fleet's every move from tourist planes and local tea houses. They felt the hot Hawaiian sun on their necks and the bitter taste of frustration, knowing they were watching a spy but unable to act decisively for fear of compromising a source they couldn't even be told about. In Tokyo, Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka felt supremely confident. In a purple dispatch dated April 22, 1941, he received a detailed report from his ambassador in Berlin, Baron Hiroshi Oshima, outlining German panzer production. Oshima, a trusted confidant of the Nazi elite, reported that the Alket factory was now producing 55 Panzer III tanks per month, each armed with the new 50mm KWK 38L/42 cannon. Matsuoka read the crisp teletype printout, smelling the faint chemical scent of the paper, and saw Japan as the secure hub of Axis intelligence. The idea that this vital communication channel, their most advanced technological achievement, was effectively a party line monitored by the Americans was not just unlikely. To Matsuoka and the entire Japanese high command, it was technically inconceivable. The finished intelligence product was treated like a holy relic. After decryption and translation by a small team led by Army Captain Alva C. Laswell, the most critical intercepts were summarized onto single sheets of special watermarked bond paper. Only 12 copies were made. Each morning at 0930, a commissioned officer, such as Army Major Ralph W. D. Woods, would place the day's summary into a locked leather briefcase, handcuff it to his wrist, and begin a hand delivery route to a list of fewer than 30 individuals. President Roosevelt, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson were always the first recipients. They would read the summary, and the officer would wait, silent and stone-faced, until the document was handed back for immediate return and incineration. The weight of that briefcase was the weight of a hidden war. The first true shockwave hit the Japanese during a diplomatic meeting on May 20, 1941. Secretary Cordell Hull, a Tennessee native with a famously stern demeanor, confronted Ambassador Nomura with shockingly precise details about the Imperial Japanese Army's recent movements into French Indochina. Hull cited the exact troop numbers of the 25th Army and the arrival dates of 3 specific transport ships in Saigon, details that had only been transmitted from Tokyo to the embassy via Purple less than 72 hours prior. Nomura, a man accustomed to the carefully controlled dance of diplomacy, was visibly stunned. He reported back to Tokyo that Hull possessed an almost magical insight into their plans, leading Foreign Minister Matsuoka to suspect a high-level human leak within his own ministry, never the machine itself. This suspicion triggered a frantic, paranoid mole hunt inside the Japanese Foreign Ministry in Tokyo. In June 1941, the Kempeitai, Japan's dreaded secret police, arrested 2 junior communications clerks, Saburo Ota and Akira Mori, on suspicion of espionage. Ota was interrogated for 56 consecutive hours under the glare of a single bare light bulb, the air thick with his own sweat and fear. He confessed to nothing because there was nothing to confess. Simultaneously, in Washington, Captain Yuzuru Sanematsu was ordered to conduct a Level 3 diagnostic on the embassy's Purple machine. For 3 days, he and 2 technicians meticulously checked every one of its 6,000 wires and 2,000 relays, finding nothing. On June 18, 1941, Sanematsu sent a coded message back to Tokyo. The machine was, in his expert opinion, flawless and absolutely secure. The human cost of this secret war was felt acutely at Arlington Hall. Sergeant Robert E. Swan, a 32-year-old radio repairman from Cleveland, Ohio, was responsible for maintaining the delicate telephone stepping switches on 2 of the M134T4 machines. His hands, once skilled at fine soldering, were now perpetually raw and chapped from the carbon tetrachloride solvent used to clean the 25 contacts on each of the 6 switch levels. He worked a grueling 12-hour shift from 1800 to 0600, the endless whirring and clacking of the machines a constant assault on his nerves. In his heavily censored letters to his wife, Mary, he could only say he was doing important communications work. He couldn't tell her about the suffocating secrecy, the windowless room, or the crushing exhaustion he felt in his bones, a weariness born from a battle he didn't fully understand. The strategic consequences were enormous. One of the most vital pieces of intelligence, gleaned in the summer of 1941, confirmed Japan's Nanshin-ran, or Southern Strike Doctrine. A series of magic intercepts in July made it clear to President Roosevelt and General Marshall that Japan had made the firm decision not to attack the Soviet Union in Siberia, freeing Stalin from the threat of a 2-front war. This intelligence was pivotal. It allowed Marshall, on August 10, 1941, to confidently redirect a massive Lend-Lease shipment, including over 2 50P-40 Warhawk fighters and 1 50M-3 Stuart tanks, from West Coast ports to the perilous Murmansk run for the USSR. Japanese naval intelligence, under Admiral Osami Nagano, could only watch in confusion as American shipping steamed west into the Atlantic, a move that made no sense if the U.S. truly feared an imminent Pacific War. No one was more helpful to the Allied cause, or more ignorant of his contribution, than Baron Hiroshi Oshima, the Japanese ambassador in Berlin. A fervent Nazi sympathizer, he was given unprecedented access by the German High Command. On August 27, 1941, after a personal tour of the Atlantic Wall defenses with General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Oshima sent a 15-part, 6,000-word report to Tokyo via Purple. It was a treasure trove, detailing concrete bunker thickness, 3.5 meters, the exact caliber of coastal artillery, 155 mm Schneider guns, and the disposition of the German 15th Army. This entire report was on the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Walter Bedell Smith, in London less than 48 hours after Oshima sent it. Oshima, preening over the praise he received from Tokyo for his detailed reporting, was effectively the Allies' most valuable spy inside the Third Reich, and he never had a clue. Convinced the security breach was human, the Japanese High Command made a fatal decision. On September 1, 1941, the new Foreign Minister, Admiral Teijiro Toyoda, issued Directive 734. It mandated that all Class A diplomatic traffic, the most secret and sensitive communications, was to be sent exclusively via the Purple system. They thought they were closing a leak. In reality, they had just ensured that every single one of their most vital secrets would be funneled directly through the M134T4 machines whirring away in a guarded room in Arlington, Virginia. The operators at Arlington Hall immediately noticed the volume of high-precedence traffic increase by over 200%. The psychological pressure on Ambassador Nomura became unbearable. During his final tense meetings with Secretary Hull in the autumn of 1941, his personal habits began to betray his anxiety. He would constantly polish his spectacles with a silk handkerchief, a nervous tic his aides had never seen before. He couldn't comprehend how Hull seemed to know his fallback positions and final proposals before he had even fully articulated them. In a private diary entry dated October 16, 1941, he wrote, "It is as if the American Secretary of State is sitting in on our meetings in Tokyo. I feel a ghost in the room." The feeling of being perpetually outthought and outmaneuvered by an opponent who seemed clairvoyant was driving the honorable, peace-leaning admiral to despair. This ignorance extended throughout the Japanese military. Aboard the destroyer Akikaze patrolling the South China Sea, Petty Officer Kenji Tanaka, a 20-year-old radio man from Nagasaki, noticed a disturbing pattern in November 1941. American PBY Catalina reconnaissance planes seemed to appear coincidentally over their convoys, secret routes, but always a day or two after the schedules had been transmitted using the primary naval operational code, JN-25. He dutifully reported this anomaly to his communications officer, Lieutenant Commander Goro Suzuki, on 3 separate occasions. Suzuki, focused entirely on the security of JN-25, dismissed the reports. The thought that a leak could originate from the untouchable, high-level diplomatic Purple system was simply not a possibility they ever considered. The art of parallel construction reached its zenith that same month. On November 26, 1941, a magic intercept revealed the precise route and schedule of a major Japanese troop convoy steaming from Shanghai to Cam Ranh Bay, carrying 22,000 men of the 38th Division. Following strict protocol from General Marshal's office, this intelligence was never sent to the fleet. Instead, a PBY Catalina from Patrol Wing 10, based in the Philippines and piloted by Lieutenant John L. Smithson, was assigned a, quote, random patrol sector that just happened to trace the convoy's exact path. On November 27th, Smithson, feeling the cool 8,000-foot air rush through his open cockpit window, broke radio silence to report his discovery. His overt, conventional report became the official intelligence, a perfect piece of camouflage for the real source, located 8,000 miles away. As the final days of peace dwindled, the Japanese Empire remained shrouded in a blissful, fatal ignorance. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto gave the final authorizations for the southern offensive, their orders transmitted to diplomatic posts via Purple, with absolute faith in its security. In the Washington Embassy on the evening of December 6, 1941, Captain Yuzuru Sanematsu personally supervised the encoding of the final, infamous 14-part message that would sever diplomatic ties. He felt the solid, satisfying resistance of the teletype keys under his fingertips, the low, steady hum of the machine a reassuring sound of secrecy and power. They were about to plunge the world into war, utterly blind to the fact that their enemy was already in the room, listening to every single word. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed magic from a strategic advantage into the single most vital intelligence source of the war. In the chaos that followed, as Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and General Walter Short were relieved of command, the 6 operational M134T4 machines at Arlington Hall and OP-20G became the sanctum sanctorum of American war planning. The constant, rhythmic clatter of their teletype outputs was no longer just the sound of a secret revealed. It was the frantic, desperate heartbeat of a nation suddenly at war, a sound that General George C. Marshall insisted receive his personal attention every morning at 07:30 hours. The war demanded a massive expansion. By June 1942, The Signal Intelligence Service, now under the operational command of the meticulous Brigadier General Spencer B. Aiken, had swelled from a staff of fewer than 350 to over 500 personnel. Leo Rosen's original M134T4 design was replicated another 12 times, with the new units housed in a sprawling, hastily constructed new wing of Arlington Hall, Building B. The air in these new decryption rooms was a mixture of fresh-cut lumber, wet paint, and the ever-present metallic tang of ozone from the thousands of new relays. Colonel William Friedman, having returned from his medical leave in mid-1941, now oversaw an industrial-scale intelligence factory, a far cry from the small, academic team of 30 he had started with. His new challenge wasn't just breaking codes, but managing a secret bureaucracy of over 200 translators and analysts working in 3 relentless 8-hour shifts. Magic's most profound impact was arguably felt 4,000 miles away in Europe. On May 15, 1943, Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima sent a detailed report to Tokyo after a personal inspection of the Atlantic Wall with General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt. The intercept, translated within 18 hours by a team led by Captain Alva C. Laswell, was on General Eisenhower's desk at SHAEF headquarters by May 17. It contained the exact concrete thickness, 3.5 meters, of the new Regelbau 688 casemates, and pinpointed a weakness in the defenses around Pas-de-Calais, confirming for Allied planners, including British Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan, that their deception plan for Normandy was working perfectly. The Oshima intercepts became a river of priceless intelligence, a direct pipeline into the Nazi high command. Baron Oshima, a man of immense vanity and trust in his hosts, dutifully reported everything. He sent Tokyo over 75 detailed reports between January 1943 and June 1944, totaling more than 200 pages of translated text. These weren't just military specs. They were intimate portraits of the enemy. He relayed a private conversation with Adolf Hitler from April 3, 1943, where the Führer admitted that production of the new Tiger II tank, with its 88mm KWK-43 gun, was falling behind schedule by at least 25 units per month. He detailed the results of V-2 rocket tests at Peenemünde and even passed on Joachim von Ribbentrop's pessimistic assessments of Italian morale. For Allied planners like General Walter Bedell Smith, it was like reading the enemy's mail, the crisp, typewritten summaries a world away from the mud and blood of the front lines. Throughout the war, the Japanese High Command never once suspected their premier diplomatic cipher was compromised. Their failures were consistently blamed on human treachery or bad luck. In late 1943, after a series of devastating convoy losses in the Solomon Islands, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, a man known for his rigid, unyielding posture, became convinced there was a high-level leak in the naval ministry. He ordered the Kimpeitai, under the ruthless Major General Akito Nakamura, to conduct a sweeping internal investigation. Over 20 officers were detained and interrogated for weeks in the cold, damp cells of the Kimpeitai headquarters, the air thick with fear and the metallic scent of blood. The real source, the M134T4 machines clattering away in Virginia, remained utterly invisible to them. The American codebreakers didn't stand still. The M134-T4, codenamed Tractor by its maintenance crews, received a critical upgrade in early 1944. A team at Bell Labs, working under the direction of Dr. Ralph Baum and in consultation with Leo Rosen, developed a new wire spring relay that was 20% faster and far more reliable than the original Western Electric stepping switches. By March 1944, all 18 Army and Navy machines had been refitted, reducing the average time to find the daily key from 8 hours to just under 6. This meant intelligence from Tokyo was often on President Roosevelt's desk before Ambassador Nomura's replacement had even finished his breakfast. This fire hose of intelligence directly shaped Allied grand strategy. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill were armed with a magic summary of Oshima's latest report, dated November 5, 1943. It detailed Germany's transfer of over 500 Luftwaffe fighters, including 150 of the formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190s, from the Western Front to combat the Soviet offensive. This hard data, provided by their enemy's ally, gave Roosevelt and his military chief, General Marshall, the leverage they needed to convince a skeptical Joseph Stalin that the Western Allies were genuinely committed to the quote, strategy and the planned cross-channel invasion, a promise sealed amidst the thick Persian carpets and heavy cigar smoke of the Soviet embassy. As the scope of magic grew, so did the security apparatus protecting it. In February 1943, the War Department created the Special Branch of the Military Intelligence Service, placing it under the command of Colonel Carter W. Clark, a stern, no-nonsense officer from Virginia. Clark, whose office was kept at a chilly 65 degrees year-round, instituted a draconian set of new protocols. The list of recipients was pruned from over 75 to just 35 key individuals. Every magic summary was now printed on a special, chemically treated paper that would dissolve in water, and the officer couriers, like a young Captain John P. Riley, were required to carry a thermite grenade in their briefcases, with standing orders to incinerate the contents rather than allow capture. The intelligence wasn't just strategic, it was tactical and life-saving. In October 1944, a magic intercept from the Japanese Southern Army headquarters in Manila revealed a new, unwritten policy issued by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Captured American B-29 aircrew were to be summarily executed as unarmed combatants. This information, relayed by Colonel Carter Clark's office directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz's CINCPAC staff, led to an immediate shift in rescue submarine patrol routes. Over the next 4 months, submarines like the USS Tang and USS Celian were credited with rescuing at least 56 downed airmen from the waters off Japan, men who would have otherwise faced certain death. By the summer of 1945, magic provided the grim, final context for the war's end. Intercepts of communications between the new Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo in Tokyo and his ambassador in Moscow, Naotake Sato, revealed Japan's desperate, clumsy attempts to negotiate a conditional surrender through the Soviets. But other intercepts, from War Minister Korachika Anami, laid bare the military's plan for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the home islands. This plan called for the use of over 10,000 kamikaze aircraft and the mobilization of 2.3 million Imperial Army soldiers, plus a 28 million-strong civilian militia. These numbers, read by President Harry S. Truman and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson in the humid quiet of the Oval Office, painted a picture of a bloodbath that would cost an estimated 1.7 million Allied casualties. The clattering machines in Arlington Hall had fallen silent and delivered their final terrible verdict. For 30 years, the silence held. The war ended, the world moved on, and the true story of Project Magic remained locked away, buried under mountains of classification stamps. The first public cracks appeared during the contentious Joint Committee hearings on Pearl Harbor in 1945-1946, where men like General George C. Marshall and Admiral Ernest King testified under oath, their words, a masterclass in evasion. They spoke of certain sources and special intelligence, but the true nature of the M134T4 machine and its product remained a ghost, haunting the official record but never revealing its face. The secret was so profound that more than 150 Army and Navy officers who knew of magic were forbidden from even mentioning it. The dam finally began to break, not in a government archive, but in the cluttered New York City office of a journalist and amateur cryptologist named David Kahn. In the mid-1960s, while researching his magnum opus, Kahn painstakingly tracked down and interviewed over 200 veterans of the Secret War, including a reluctant, but proud, Frank Byron Rowlett. Armed with these first-hand accounts and declassified fragments, Khan reconstructed the story. When the National Security Agency, the secretive successor to the SIS, learned of his work in 1966, they made a clumsy attempt to suppress it, even suggesting the government buy the manuscript to keep it from being published. But it was too late. The publication of *The Codebreakers in 1967, a massive volume of over 180 pages, put the word magic into the public consciousness for the very first time, though the official documents confirming it remained locked in NSA vaults, the faint smell of aging paper a testament to their hidden power. The true deluge came on October 24, 1978. After years of persistent Freedom of Information Act requests filed by historians like Dr. Ronald Lewin, the NSA began the slow, grudging declassification of the Special Research Histories, or SRH files. It was inside the sterile, climate-controlled environment of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., that a young NSA historian, Dr. Thomas L. Johnson, was tasked with processing the first batch. He opened a worn cardboard box, file number SRH 149, and was hit by the musty, slightly acidic scent of 35-year-old mimeograph paper. The title read, "The Friedman Lectures on Cryptology." Inside were over 200 pages detailing the mathematical and engineering principles behind the breaking of purple. For the first time since 1945, the Ghost in the Machine had a technical manual. The impact on the historical community was an academic earthquake. For decades, the dominant narrative of Pearl Harbor, shaped by revered historians like Gordon Prange, was one of a brilliant, complete surprise. But the newly declassified magic intercepts, particularly the infamous 14-part message from December 6, 1941, proved that a definitive warning existed. As historian Roberta Wohlstetter later wrote, the problem wasn't a lack of signals, but a catastrophic failure to interpret them. The revelation shifted the entire focus of debate from Japanese cunning to American incompetence and bureaucratic paralysis. This new reality was a profound shock in Japan. Former diplomats and military officers, now old men in their 70s and 80s, learned the truth from translations of American books like James Bamford's 1982 exposé, The Puzzle Palace. Captain Yuzuru Sanematsu, the man who had personally vouched for the Purple Machine's integrity, was reportedly stunned into silence for 2 days upon learning the news. For over 30 years they had believed their most secure channel was inviolable, that their defeats stemmed from human spies or tactical errors. The revelation that the Americans had been listening all along, that their confidence was a fatal illusion, was a deeply humiliating and disorienting blow, rewriting the narrative of their own history. The declassified documents revealed a scope far beyond Pearl Harbor. File SRH 034, The Role of Magic in the European War, contained hundreds of translated intercepts from Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima in Berlin. Historians could now see the raw intelligence that shaped Allied strategy. One intercept, J-19 message number 83, dated August 27, 1941, contained Oshima's 6,000-word report on the Atlantic Wall defenses. Scholars like John Costello could now draw a direct, unbroken line from this specific document to the Allied decision to commit over 60% of their resources to the Germany First strategy. The brittle yellowed pages, covered in the blocky typeface of a 1940s teletype, were the unseen hand that had guided the war, a silent partner in every major Allied command decision. For the silent warriors of Arlington Hall, it was a long overdue vindication. In 1981, Frank Byron Rowlett, then 73 years old, was finally able to give a full oral history to the National Security Agency. His voice, still carrying a faint Virginia accent, was steady as he recounted the exact moment on September 20, 1940, when he saw the pattern in the sixes. Men like Leo Rosen, the MIT prodigy, could at last explain the complex web of over 2,000 relays and 6,000 wires to a new generation of engineers. For decades they had carried the weight of a secret that had won the war, unable to share their triumph even with their own families. Now, the silence was finally broken. The declassification process itself was a battle. The NSA, under directors like Admiral Stansfield Turner, fought for years to protect what it called sources and methods, arguing that revealing the full story could compromise contemporary intelligence operations. It took nearly 20 years of legal challenges and political pressure from the mid-1970s through the early 1990s, spearheaded by organizations like the American Historical Association, to pry the majority of the magic-related documents loose. This slow, agonizing release meant that the full picture of magic's impact emerged not in a flood, but as a mosaic, pieced together one declassified SRH file at a time, each one adding another crucial tile to the true history of the war. The revelation completely transformed our understanding of wartime leadership. The seemingly uncanny foresight of President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull during the 1941 negotiations was no longer a mystery. Historians could now read the magic summary from November 27, 1941, that lay on FDR's desk, which explicitly stated that Japan's final proposal was a sham and that war was imminent. This wasn't just diplomacy. It was a poker game where one player could see the other's cards. Books published after 1990, like Gerhard Weinberg's *A World at Arms*, could now cite the specific intercepts that proved the American oil embargo of July 26, 1941, wasn't a blind gamble, but a calculated response to hard intelligence that Japan had irrevocably chosen its path of conquest. The final, tangible proof came into public view on December 3, 1999. In a quiet ceremony, the National Security Agency declassified and transferred one of the last surviving M134T4 purple analog machines to the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade, Maryland. There it stands today, a 2-ton monster of steel, wire, and telephone relays. Veterans, their movements slowed by age, can now bring their grandchildren to this place, point to the silent, gleaming machine, and finally explain the secret they carried for a lifetime. The clatter of the relays has long since faded, replaced by the quiet hum of museum lighting, the sound of a secret finally at peace. The long overdue recognition, when it finally came, was a quiet affair, a world away from the global conflict these men had shaped. On October 26, 1964, in a closed ceremony at the Pentagon, President Lyndon B. Johnson posthumously awarded the National Security Medal to Colonel William Friedman, who had passed away in 1969. Frank Byron Rowlett and Leo Rosen stood by, their faces etched with the passage of 24 years, as Friedman's widow Elizabeth accepted the honor. The citation praised his, quote, monumental contributions, a deliberately vague phrase that still couldn't speak the full truth. The soft, polite applause in the room felt like a whisper compared to the deafening, world-changing clatter of the machine they had built in secret. The legacy of magic wasn't just in medals. It was in the complete rewriting of history. The work of historians like Roberta Wallstetter, in her seminal 1962 book, Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision, used the first trickles of declassified information to shift the narrative from a simple surprise attack to a complex intelligence failure. The undeniable success of signals intelligence, a power proven by the M134T4 and its British counterparts at Bletchley Park, provided the direct justification for President Harry S. Truman's secret directive on November 4, 1952, which created the National Security Agency. This single act institutionalized the work of Friedman's small team, transforming the art of code-breaking into a global technological apparatus that would define the strategic landscape of the Cold War and beyond. The faint, musty smell of old history books was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of new ones, their pages telling a profoundly different story. Today, Arlington Hall Station shows few scars of its secret past. The stately brick buildings now house the Army National Guard Readiness Center and the State Department's Foreign Service Institute, where new diplomats learn their trade, oblivious to the fact that the greatest diplomatic secret of the 20th century was unraveled beneath their feet, but the ghost in the machine has a final home. At the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade, Maryland, an original M134T4 purple analog sits in silent, hulking testimony. Its 2,000 relays and 6,000 wires are inert, displayed under the cool, quiet hum of museum lights. Visitors can see the very teletype machine that printed out Japan's march to war, a 2-ton relic that cost the U.S. government less than $100,000 to build, and, by some estimates from historians like John Costello, shortened the war by at least 2 years. The ultimate lesson of magic was a harsh one about the nature of information in warfare. The intelligence failure of Pearl Harbor wasn't a lack of data. It was a failure of imagination and dissemination, a problem of bureaucratic stovepipes that men like General George C. Marshall and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson vowed never to repeat. This led directly to the creation of centralized intelligence bodies, like the CIA in 1947 and the NSA in 1952, designed to synthesize and distribute critical intelligence to the highest levels. The quiet work of Frank Rowlett, Leo Rosen, and the more than 400-500 people who eventually worked on magic is credited with saving over 1 million Allied lives and providing the foundational doctrine for modern American signals intelligence, a legacy that echoed through the Cold War, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the fall of the Berlin Wall. In the spring of 1998, just months before he passed away, an elderly Frank Byron Rowlett made one last visit to the National Cryptologic Museum. He walked slowly, aided by a cane, until he stood before the massive, silent M134T4 machine. For a long moment, he simply stared at the jungle of wires and relays he had helped will into existence. Then, with a hand trembling slightly from age, he reached out and laid his palm flat against the cold, gray steel of the teletypewriter's housing. He said nothing. The gesture was enough. It was a final, silent communion with the ghost he had been the first to see, a quiet acknowledgement of a secret kept and a war won, finally brought out of the shadows and into the light.